Dear viewers, many thanks for joining us. You are watching our weekly program, Talk to OBN. This is OBN Horn of Africa, your favorite channel. Today we're going to discuss about AU-led peace talk, which is under making. And the second one is COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh, UN Climate Change World Leaders Summit, which was held in Egypt. I joined by Dr. Samuel Teferra, Horn political analyst and assistant professor at Addis Ababa University for his commentary on these two agendas. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Addis.
Okay, how do you see the overall dynamics of AU-led negotiation between the federal government of Ethiopia and the TPLF?
Thank you very much. As someone who loves peace, as someone who loves development, that was a wonderful news for all of us in Ethiopia and beyond, because this will definitely herald the end to the 2 years conflict that was happening in North Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian government, of course, have always been promoting ideals of peace in the country and in the region, and Ethiopia has a very good historical record of contributing towards not only peace in the region but global peace, and that can be manifested in many different ways, out of which the major ones are Ethiopia's commitment to the global peace, collective peace agenda through sending the peacekeeping missions, which dates back to the early 90s during his Imperial Haile Selassie's time. Ethiopia has sent its troops to the war between the two Koreans, mandated by the United Nations the Security Council, and Ethiopians has contributed a lot to the ending of the conflict. Then we've sent peacekeeping missions to Congo, Liberia, Darfur, in South Sudan, Abyei, which is very much heralded by both the United Nations Security Council and also by the two countries. It's a very historical time that not only the United Nations Security Council has unanimously approved Ethiopia as the country to send its peacekeeping missions between South Sudan and contested areas in North Sudan, but also the two countries, the two governments have unanimously accepted Ethiopia's presence to mediate the conflict. So since then, and also through the missions in Somalia, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia has contributed a lot to the global collective peace, and that was the principle it stood all across those decades, regardless of who administered Ethiopia actually as a government and as a political party.
Okay, among the peace deal, which took so many people's attention, is the willingness of TPLF to disarm itself. And what is your take on about this willingness?
That's always a point of interest to discuss and debate about. Yeah, of course, different groups will have their own differences, and the best way has always been and is always to reconcile those differences through roundtable discussions, right? Negotiations would serve better to resolve the disputes that exist between two parties, and the same is true here. And TPLF has, as we know, have been pushing aside opportunities to resolve the differences that it had with the federal government in Ethiopia, and that has contributed to the continuous atrocities, human rights violations, killings, mass rapes, and all the evils that we can list. And after all, through the government interventions, like military interventions over the past 2 years, TPLF has come to a point where continuing with such momentum would bring some challenges on its part. And also added to this is the Ethiopian government commitment, the Ethiopian people's commitment actually to halt the conflict in the region and stop the distractions. And those two, the ground operations with the defense force and the allied forces, and again the push towards a lasting peace and to curb human suffering in the region were the major contributing factors that forced TPLF, and also with the willingness of the government of Ethiopia to sit down together and resolve differences. Not only that, as some scholars, some analysts say also, there is a question on the part of the Ethiopian government as to why it is inviting the African Union to negotiate, to mediate the peace deal, to do the brokering. And Ethiopia has commitment, as I have said. Ethiopia has always been committed to peaceful ideals, and particularly after the transformation of the Organization of African Union into the African Union, there were a number of issues and documents signed to create a favorable environment in the continent in terms of bringing a lasting peace and silence the guns. The preceding organization, the African Organization of African Unity, has tried to resolve disputes between different countries, which many of them were not successful. We can raise the border conflict and the border claims of the Moroccos on Algeria, the Western Saharan Republic and Morocco challenges, and the Darfur crisis, and a lot can be said, with fewer only achievements contributing to positive peace development. And this has been continuing up until the early 1990s, when the genocide in Rwanda happened and millions have actually were dead, and that led actually the United Nations Security Council to endorse and declare the formation of the Responsibility to Protect Act, which means the international community, through the regional organizations, continental organizations, have obligations to protect and to positively intervene to stop, for example, war crimes, human rights violations, and also acts of genocide. So taking and building upon those lessons, the African Union, the newly established African Union, has also endorsed its own declaration, which is the principle of non-indifference. I mean, like, states cannot, the international community and the African Union member states cannot see and claim themselves as indifferent to human rights abuses in the continent. So governments would be responsible for their actions when they fail to protect their own people. The Union would be interfering in many different ways. But here comes a point where Ethiopia, continuing on its past collective peace ideals, has invited, the African Union was invited by Ethiopia. It's not a common phenomenon elsewhere. But Ethiopia, as it did with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, as it brought back the issue from the United Nations Security Council to the African Union and make it an African agenda.
The same thing is working for this deal as well.
So repeated, the same thing, calling the African Union to intervene in an affair of an internal affair, I would say, to mediate and then bring a lasting solution to the conflict that we have in the country. So this also shows, its commitment towards addressing and bringing African solutions, mechanisms to end violences through African knowledge. So here comes the panel of the WISE and other structures through the Peace and Security Council of the African Union has contributed a lot, with South Africa being the host, to bring the two parties together and then discuss, deliberate their differences through a peaceful and civilized way.
Let me pause you there. Especially the US and the European Union strived a lot to meddle in this peace talk. Funny enough, Special Envoy of the US to the Horn of Africa, Mike Hammer, took part on the Pretoria peace talk as participant and observer. Is that possible to act this way? Meaning, can we genuinely say it's hosted by African Union? I need to substantiate that it's a kind of hidden political agenda there by the US. Can you agree though?
Yeah, there have always been this kind of scenarios. The GERD again was a very good manifestation of that, right? Where the United States, beyond being and playing the role of an observer, have tried to be the main mediator of the negotiations between the tripartite bodies, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. You can remember that. Ethiopia has insisted, of course, and finally won to bring the case back to the African soil. And again, even in this part, the West have been very vocal in terms of the continued war developments, conflict developments, not only in Ethiopia, actually in our region. So they have some interest, they have some stake, which was propagated through the international media, the Western-sponsored medias. They have spent in millions of dollars to cover up those stories of sufferings and challenge happening in the atrocities in Ethiopia, and without giving due considerations to the positive steps in terms of ensuring humanitarian aid and assistance channeled to those who deserve it, in terms of showcasing the efforts that the Ethiopian government and peace lovers in the region and beyond have been doing to curb the conflict before further bringing in more sufferings to people, challenges to the economy, and so on and so forth. So it was an expected scenario for myself. But even in this, in the peace talks in South Africa, the United States have only the role of an observer in the actual talks. What happens beyond that is something that we can expect, right? So the West and any other country, as far as geopolitics is concerned, have an interest. It could be China, it could be the US, it could be the EU, it could be some other African Union countries, Russia, whoever is there has an interest in the region. So the question to contribute in those peace talks as observers and mediators is very much justified by those interests, national and regional interests. And it is clear, geopolitically speaking, the stronger would want to remain stronger, oppressing other smaller voices. And this actually is against the current trends of a changing global political order, which is bringing multiple actors and multiple nation states to join the mightier and the bigger economically military states. So all those actions from the West were against those kind of newly emerging establishments changing the global world order. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is a very good manifestation of that. It's not, for me, it's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war the West is fighting to suppress the ability of the Russians and allies and make sure that it remains geopolitically the major decision maker, the major influencer in the region. And that could happen anywhere else. That's very understandable, and that's the way I see it.
Okay. I mean, since the day one of the war in northern part of Ethiopia, superpowers and other states have been requesting Ethiopian government to execute ceasefire. And due to the war which had been ongoing there, so many sanctions after sanctions, restricting visas for high-profile government officials, and aid cut, you see, cut of alliance, and sort of. The major reason was unless the Ethiopian government stop war or execute ceasefire, the aid which had been allotted to Ethiopia shouldn't be given. And now cessation of hostilities and silencing the gun are among the agreement of AU-led peace talk. Do you think those sanctions would be lifted up and Ethiopia would be peacefully run with those superpowers?
I am, and I will always be an optimist when it comes to peace and development. That's the personality I have. So I would expect that the the agreement that was signed in Pretoria, South Africa, to permanently stop or to the agreement reached on permanent cessation of hostilities and fires would work best to both sides, particularly to the people of Ethiopia. Hoping that another fourth round invasion by TPLF is not going to happen and create inconveniences, ruining the agreement that we arrive. That's the position I have now. Like, I would hope that peace will a lasting peace will prevail in our country and in our region. But looking at the previous 3 rounds of attacks and conflicts that we have been to, and the casualties that came in response to the government's interventions on TPLF invasion of territories outside of Tigray, also even inside of Tigray, because Tigray is part and parcel of the Ethiopian state. And given the behavior of the party and the establishment itself, we cannot rule out a potential challenge to abide by the agreements signed in Pretoria. So I mean, while being optimist to the fact that the signing of the agreement would pave the way for more peace, development and revival of the economy, continued people-to-people relationships, businesses and development, I would also be considered as someone cautious enough to not rule out on the flip side possibilities for renewed conflict.
Okay, let me get back to my previous question. I mean, TPLF has agreed to disarm itself, and per the very historical nature of TPLF, in your, bear in your mind, would TPLF go through that big commitment to disarm itself and come to the usual peace sphere?
I would say so this time, because when two parties come to the round table for negotiation, it could be considered from two major points of view. One is that either of the party is committing to a lasting peace, and the other one is either of the two parties or both have some concessions to make beyond which they couldn't proceed with the conflict, within the conflict, right? So in this case, it's very clear, right? So one, there is a genuine commitment on the part of the Ethiopian government and Ethiopians all over, peace-loving Ethiopians in Tigray, Amara, Afar, and throughout the country, to bring this conflict to an end, to a halt. And on the other part, TPLF over the past 2 years have conceded a lot. So these are the scenarios that created for both parties to summon, to come together to resolve their differences in Pretoria. And I would say that TPLF would no more continue in this war, and it doesn't take the party, the group, to anywhere, any further, if the war continues. It affects the costs of the war are actually affecting Ethiopia as a whole, and both fighting parties in particular. But it's not the same when you're a government, and it's not the same when you're a group which is encircled and has no more support to receive from international parties who have been fueling this conflict, and in the international media who have been propagating this conflict to continue. So to me, TPLF is under pressure, and that actually forced the party to come to a round table, which is a good cause.
Okay, appreciate it. Okay, let me proceed to my second discussion point, which is COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh UN Climate Change World Leaders Summit held in Egypt. And it's a very honorary summit. Head of states and head of government of different nations have been shown up and voted and addressed their remarks regarding the very burning issue, climate change. And funny enough, we haven't heard any acknowledgement from top leaders, including Biden and Antonio Guterres, in appreciating Ethiopia's commitment to reclaim this green legacy initiative. And everybody was talking about how the issue of climate change is becoming a very global agenda. Ethiopia is executing this big mega greenery legacy, even by going beyond its border. Recently, a team drawn from different parts of Ethiopia went to Sudan, South Sudan, Djibouti, Kenya to plant millions of trees, but no one had appreciated this. What is the reason behind? And Prime Minister Abiy was there. He has been shown up there, but I don't know the reason. He couldn't get a chance to speak on that already per diem. It has its own reason. We don't know. Can you reflect on it?
I think, to me, I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't be expecting the world to give us a recognition for what we do. Of course, that could have been the case, but we are in a sort of plot, right? A plot to keep the country very small, to erode its historical presence, historical image, right, in the region. So this is part of another plot to keep Ethiopia small. Regardless of that, Ethiopia has contributed a lot. The Ethiopian government has done a lot in terms of its the green legacy, like the afforestation activities, the reforestation activities, combating deforestation, and also on investing a lot on issues that would promote carbon financing and then reduce Ethiopia's carbon footprints to a zero by 2015, which is part of Ethiopia's long-term 10 years strategic plan to cut emissions. Previous COP conferences were much focused on carbon emissions, like reducing carbon emissions. This has always been the agenda, plus negotiations happening between the North and the South groups. The South requesting,
including the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, including the Paris Agreement to reduce the emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius limits, and again requesting the African climate negotiators groups and others also elsewhere in the developing South, requesting the North for the problems that it has caused from emissions while industrializing its economies. And there was a pledge by the North to pay in compensation about $100 million, which was not in effect up until this conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So those commitments are not met, but while small countries like Ethiopia, through those green legacy initiatives and others, have been contributing significantly to a reduced emission activities. The forests that we are contributing to, like the forests that's going to be created from the green legacy program, which so far we have managed to plant about 25 billion seedlings. That's a huge number. Would be big future carbon sequestrates, contributing largely to a reduced global warming. These are initiatives that would have been highlighted and appreciated. So we know that this is part of a plot. So what we should do is just continue on our effort to make an emission-free country, to contribute to other Ethiopian neighboring countries to continue on these sort of engagements, and Ethiopian government has been doing on that. So we don't need to be waiting appreciations. We have the issue of wheat production. We have other different interesting issues that we are...
Yes, Doctor, I do have my own reason to raise such a question. In his remark, President Biden of the US has said Horn of Africa is in a very bad situation. It's under heat of drought and famine over the past couple of years, he said, but never utter any word about this Green Legacy initiative in Ethiopia.
Here in Africa, home to many nations considered most vulnerable to climate change, food insecurity. Hunger follows 4 years of intense drought in the Horn of Africa. Meanwhile, the Niger River in West Africa, swollen because of more intense rainfall, is wreaking havoc on fishing and farming communities. In Nigeria, flooding has recently killed 600 people. 1.3 million more are displaced.
Anyway, as we have said, we shouldn't wait any appreciation from any stake. Among the speech made by Antonio Guterres, in quotation, he said, greenhouse gas emission keep growing, global temperature keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot accelerator on the accelerator. Here, as far as my knowledge concerned, this COP is hosted annually, right? It's more of ceremonial than any practical implementation on the ground. And again, this world leaders should learn from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is becoming a model for such curbing climate problem. If you have anything that you need to substantiate by taking Ethiopia as a role model for such talk annually, Ethiopia is doing its best.
Yeah, our growth models in Ethiopia always have been aiming at reducing emissions, and also they have always been climate smart. That was the trend. But as we have been saying earlier, even in the, if you've noticed, in the COP27, while different world leaders representing their countries have been voicing their opinions, Ethiopia was not given that opportunity. There was a deliberate attempt that actually succeeded in pushing Ethiopia's voice not to be heard, while the Prime Minister was supposed to be addressing the assembly, the participants, on what Ethiopia has been undertaking so far with regards to practically implementing the previous COP deliberations into action, where actually the COP27 has been also framed. This year's theme was framed to focus more on implementation. Ethiopia could have been a champion in terms of what has been doing in the past, even the past 1 year after the Glasgow conference, the Glasgow deliberations
in Scotland,
in Scotland, in the UK, also in Ireland, the deliberations in the previous COP27 discussions, conferences, have specifically discussed on increasing afforestation activities and combating deforestation measures, because the carbons are one of the sinks along with the oceans which sink carbon dioxide and reduce global warming. And we are being a victim of what others elsewhere do while industrializing their economics. And given that now the world is in a mess more with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and lack of many European countries and others to access gas and energy, the challenges that came with it, like the energy challenges, with recent announcement of Germany and other countries to go back to their coal production, reopening the coal industry, I would expect more emissions are yet to challenge our globe, our world.
Dear viewers, we would like to wrap up our today's discussion on AU-led negotiation between the Ethiopian federal government and TPLF, as well as the second discussion point was COP27 UN Climate Summit, which was held in Egypt. This brings you the end of our edition for today. Goodbye. Have a nice time.